Hey everyone, this is Mrs. Moriarty and I'm here to discuss with us topic 1.6, which is now all about the phosphorus cycle. So remember, now in class we've begun talking about biogeochemical cycles, how the important nutrients that organisms need in order to survive, how do those filter through living things as well as non-living things. So here in 1.6, right, looking at how phosphorus gets cycled through living things, right, notice the same terminology is used in each of our cycles, right? We're going to have sources or places where phosphorus is released versus sinks, which is places where phosphorus is going to be stored. Some of the major reservoirs of the phosphorus cycle is going to be rocks and sediments, right? Rocks and sediments contain minerals of phosphorus. And that's going to be kind of like our main place and where we tend to see phosphorus stored for long periods of time. Now, a phosphorus cycle is really unique in that it doesn't have an atmospheric component as does our carbon, water, and nitrogen cycles do. Because phosphorus doesn't have an atmospheric component, is why phosphorus as an element is a limiting factor to a lot of living things found in aquatic ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems, right? Because phosphorus is not really readily available to them, it can impact how well that ecosystem can grow. So usually it's very scarce in aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. Some major natural sources of phosphorus is the process of weathering from rocks. So that's when we see actual rock breaking down, usually due to maybe wind or rain. Sometimes we can get like chemical weathering, physical weathering. Now, the process of weathering, though, is a very slow process. So once again, that's a part of the reason why it is a limiting factor for a lot of living organisms. Some synthetic or human sources of phosphorus can be when we mine phosphorus from rock, as well as add it to our fertilizers and use it in our detergents and cleaners. Synthetic fertilizers that contain phosphorus when added to lawns or maybe an agricultural field can be carried into different waterways, and since it is a limiting factor, when those aquatic ecosystems get lots and lots of phosphorus, they tend to grow very rapidly, and in some cases can experience what's called eutrophication. That is where we tend to see a green film on that aquatic ecosystem, and as a result, we tend to see a hypoxic zone or a lack of oxygen as a result. Now, how do living things obtain phosphorus, especially if it is a limiting factor? So similar to nitrogen, phosphorus is going to be absorbed via plant roots. They can then assimilate that phosphorus into their types of tissues. So we can find phosphorus in their proteins, DNA. Phosphorus is then given to consumers by consuming plant life, right? That's how we obtain our phosphorus. We can see animal waste, plant matter, and other biomass can then be broken down into the soils, and where decomposers like bacteria can help to return that phosphate to the soil to kind of start that cycle all over again. So how does phosphorus then move abiotically? Phosphates don't really dissolve very well into water. Much of it forms kind of like solid bits of phosphates that can wind up falling to the bottom and forming a sedimentary layer. Here, over time, they can be compressed, and eventually, through tectonic plate movement, right, known as geological uplift. So this is now the forcing up of rock layers that can help to form mountains, can then wind up starting this kind of phosphorus cycle all over again. So we can see in the image to the left here, we get geological uplift, right? So the movement of that sedimentary rock that stores phosphorus for very long periods of time. Eventually we'll get weathering of those phosphate rocks. With that weathering and erosion, plants can then take in that phosphorus, assimilate it into their tissues. Consumers can eat those plants and get their phosphorus, right? Decomposers can break down dead plants, dead animals, and return that phosphorus. Some cases we can even see that phosphorus being leached or moved right into aquatic ecosystems via runoff. And we can see kind of that similar cycle happen there once again. So some common human impacts to the phosphorus cycle, like I said before, is that eutrophication. So that extra input of that limiting nutrient makes algae grow tremendously fast. But when we see that algae bloom cover the surface of water, that actually blocks any sunlight from being able to penetrate into the waterway, killing any and all plants below that surface. Eventually, the algae do die off. Bacteria, naturally found in that aquatic ecosystem, will break down the dead algae, and they will use up the oxygen to do so. Lower oxygen levels then continue. Lower oxygen levels kill any aquatic life. Decomposers continue to break those things down. So actually, this almost winds up becoming what's called a positive feedback loop. So this is where we see, right, less oxygen, more dead organisms equals more decomposition, less oxygen, only furthering that cycle. To then we have really minimal amount of oxygen left and no life. All right, so here is our phosphorus cycle all together. Remember, big pieces are the fact that phosphorus does not have an atmospheric component. Phosphorus is a limiting nutrient for life on terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Phosphorus tends to move due to the weathering and erosions of rock. All right, practice FRQ here, guys. If you pause the video, identify the largest reservoir for phosphorus and explain why phosphorus is often a limiting factor in aquatic ecosystems. All right, at this point, we should have answered our FRQ in the Edpuzzle as well as in our notes. Here, the largest reservoir for phosphorus would be our sedimentary rock. We know weathering and the breaking down of rock is going to be much greater on land than it may be in oceans and lakes, and so phosphorus is often found in only very trace amounts in aquatic ecosystems, making it a limiting factor or nutrient. Alright everyone, that is it for our video on the phosphorus cycle 1.6. If you have any questions, please leave that at the end of the video.